Hi folks, Robert Lowell Goller here. Thank you for joining me for our weekly chat about local history. I am in the Grove, which is part of Hamlin Park, and it is one of my favorite places here in East Aurora. Not only because I grew up a block away from it, but it has such great history, and it's also a wonderful place for community gatherings today. We're still using it in a wonderful way. So its present day use is wonderful, its present day story is wonderful, its past is also fantastic. So I want to talk a little bit about it today. The Grove is actually a third of what is today Hamlin Park. The park grew in 3 different sections over time, and the Grove is a third of it. This part was always called the Grove, and then the middle section is the baseball diamond, athletic fields, and then what I like to call athletic fields part 2 is the end to the furthest south that way, where Greg's Place is, and that developed even later. But the Grove has been around for nearly 200 years, probably longer than that even, but used as a grove for picnics and things for almost 200 years. But the trees have been here in this section of the park for a very long time. In fact, it's quite interesting how this grove developed. It has always been here, and when the early settlers came here, they actually started clearing the land for building their houses and their farms, mostly their farms, and they would clear all the trees out. And somehow this little patch of trees in our community remained. And the Grove, they called it the Grove from the very beginning, was part of a larger farm that went all the way to Main Street and all this area around here. And it was in the early days owned by the Payne family. You might recognize Payne Street, and that was part of their farm. This whole area was part of it. And in the middle of that farm, and there were some apple orchards later on, but in the middle of that farm was this grove of mostly maple trees, some pine trees, and there's a bunch of other varieties too, but the early maps indicate that it was a grove of mostly maple trees. And it just was here and preserved, and no one ever took it down, and it was part of this bigger farm. And there's this great little booklet called East Aurora Illustrated that we have lots of copies of because they printed thousands of them back in 1891. And it has this really neat description of what they called at the time the village park, even though it wasn't the park yet. And it says, a pleasant little feature in the plan of the village is the park which the land company proposes to give to the village. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. There was a housing development company that had owned this at one time, and they're a very important part of the history of this grove. The beautiful valley of the Cazenovia, extending southward to the state of Pennsylvania, and within which is located the village of East Aurora, was covered at the time of its earlier settlement with a dense forest of beech, maple, and oak. By a rare good fortune, the axe of the settler was turned aside in its work of destruction, and a bit of this native forest, forming a plat of several acres, was left unmarred, and now lies within the corporate limits of the village and near its center. After the valley became settled, while the woods on all sides gradually melted away, this little remnant of woodland was preserved, suffering only the loss of a tree here and there on its outskirts. The material for a park is about to fulfill the destiny for which it has been through so many years. So this little patch of trees just kind of, I don't want to say accidentally, because humans actually made a choice not to take it down, but goes back several hundred years to the early settlements when they were clearing all around it, and this patch stayed. Now, it was originally just called the Grove on the Payne farm, and the reason we know that is I've been researching quite a bit. I have an upcoming book, as I've talked about before, a series of books actually about the history of East Aurora, and the first book is going to include a section about Hamlin Park, and there's so much great history here. And one of the chapters is about the Grove and the development of the Grove. So I've done a lot of research into it. And the reason we know the early days of this is because they recorded it in the newspapers. In 1850 and 1854, one of the neat neat parts of the history of Hamlin Park, particularly this grove, is in 1850 and 1854, the Erie County Fair was held right here, right where I'm sitting. And so just picture behind me the Erie County Fair happening. Now, mind you, there weren't carnival rides or anything, but the farmers would bring their animals here for judging, and there would be tents for the women's department, crafts and home goods and things of that nature in the 1850s. Quilting, it was all documented in the newspapers, and the newspaper called this the beautiful grove on the Payne farm here in East Aurora. And so at the time that it was used for the Erie County Fair, and I write quite a bit about this in the book, too much to go into detail now about why we don't have the fair here in East Aurora. We actually wanted it here, the Erie County Fair, but it didn't end up that way. But at the time that this grove was used for the fair, it was just part of this much larger farm, and it's hard to imagine no houses around Hamlin Park, no streets, no houses. This patch was just in the middle of a farm. And you can look at some cool old photographs. Actually, in this little booklet, there's a picture of the 1890s of the grove and all the trees. And I think this is actually kind of looking in the same direction that we're that we're sitting now. That you're getting sort of a similar view of the grove and the little hill that goes up. It was just full of trees, and people would come here for picnics. And that it was privately owned. So the Payne family owned it, and then later on a family called the Holmes family. So it got the name Holmes Grove later on. 4th of July celebrations were held here, church picnics were held here, but only at the invitation of these owners. So it got sold from the Payne family. There may have been other owners in between the Paynes and the Holmes family, and they owned land all the way to Main Street. And again, it was just the grove as part of a bigger farmland. Then by the late 1800s, the houses started developing around it. And the East Aurora Land and Improvement Company, which at the time of this booklet, this was put out by the East Aurora Businessmen's Association in 1891. More people were moving in East Aurora. They were building more houses. The Roycroft was happening. The horse racing down and horse breeding down at the other end of town. East Aurora, the train had come right after the Civil War. So East Aurora was growing, and this booklet was put out to encourage people, sort of a promotional booklet, to consider moving here. And so one of the features they talked about here, of course, was the park, the nice little village park that was going to develop out of the grove, and which is kind of interesting because they were talking about how we were preserving this grove area, but at the same time we're building houses all the way around it, and it was threatened. So at the same time they were talking about how wonderful this village park was, they're threatening it with houses built around it. Now, Mr. Erisman owned this land for a while, and it was connected to the big field that used to be on Walnut Street. All this land was owned by them, and there was always concern that because it was privately owned, that people would not be able to use it, that an owner would buy it and then shut it off, that we wouldn't be able to use Hamlin Park anymore, or Holmes Grove at the time. And so there was always this concern. So Mr. Erisman actually offered to give part of the grove, not the full thing, part of the grove to the village as a village park. This was in the 1880s. But the one thing, he put a caveat on it that he wanted to have the town and village forgive his property taxes for 50 years or something, and not only for himself but for his family. So he wouldn't have property taxes on all his properties for that long, and the village just couldn't accept that offer. So the land he retained this grove, but he allowed people to continue to use it. So there were still picnics here. And so then Mr. Erisman ended up selling it to this East Aurora Land and Improvement Company, and the houses that are all around Hamlin Park, most of them anyway, were divided into lots, housing lots, and people bought houses. So Sycamore Street, Linden Avenue, South Street. So they were building these houses, but they also bought this piece of land right here, the grove. They also bought a meadow that was to the south of the grove, which the baseball diamond had not been there yet. So my research into the baseball diamond is that it was developed kind of informally in a meadow south of this grove. and that then they started having formal baseball games. In about 1893, the formal baseball game started in that grove. So the people were using this grove as a public park, but it wasn't a public park. It was owned by this East Aurora Land and Improvement Company. The company actually had a plan to donate, as it said in here in the East Aurora Illustrated and in newspaper articles that I've researched, had a plan to donate this grove and the park to the village for a village park. That never happened. For years, it just was an idea that was put out there as a great idea, but it never happened. They retain ownership of it. And I don't know particularly why, but I think they wanted to control the park that they were developing houses around. If it became a public park, there might have been some complications for their plan. One of their plans, which was quite interesting, if you look at some of the old maps, there is one old map in particular, is the plan was to take Park Place, which is right behind me. I'm actually sitting right where they were planning for it to come through the grove, go all the way through what was the meadow at the time, and down through Griggs Place, and meet up with where South Park Place is today. If you look at an aerial view, you see that that Park Place and South Park Place would meet up, and that was the plan. The one map shows the grove with the road going right through the middle of it. And then the meadow, where the baseball diamond is today, had housing lots. And so they were going to have Park Place go right through the park, and the grove would have been split in half. Thank goodness that didn't happen, because we wouldn't have the baseball diamond that later came out of it, and the grove would have been split up. So the East Aurora Land and Improvement Company owns it until the late 1890s, and they had indicated that they would be interested in selling it. And that got people worried. That got people in the village worried, because we had been always using it. And the East Aurora Advertiser had editorialized that we really need to start making a decision about a village park. In addition to lights and a real waterworks, a real water system in the community. So it was one of many, several different infrastructure ideas that were happening in the 1890s. And so to have a village park was seen as very important. So because the East Aurora Land and Improvement Company had offered to sell it, the village was offering to buy it. And so, but it costs money, it's thousands of dollars. And the asking price was, I believe, $7,000. There were two different prices for the grove, and then what had developed into the baseball diamond later. And so in 1899, the villagers went to the polls and voted in a special election to purchase. Now, they could decide to just purchase the grove, which had become an important picnic area, or just purchase the baseball diamond, or purchase them both together. Well, they decided to overwhelmingly voted to buy them both together, so that the other question became moot of whether to buy one section and not the other section. So they decided to buy both, and then their taxes would go up. That village had to actually borrow money, bond, in order to purchase Hamlin Park. Well, in the meantime, Mr. Hamlin, Cicero Hamlin, who was operating and owned the village farm, a world-famous horse farm at where Hamlin Avenue is today. And some people often confuse, they think his farm was here because it's named Hamlin Park. But actually his farm was up where Hamlin Avenue is on the west end, north side of Main Street. He had heard that the village, he had lived in Buffalo, one of the wealthiest men outside of New York City in New York State, and he had gotten wind that the village was going to buy the park. And so he purchased the park from underneath the village. He sent a check to the East Aurora Land and Improvement Company to buy the park, and talks to village trustees and says, this is my plan. I'm going to buy the park and I'm going to give it to the community, including this glorious grove that everyone was so concerned about, the grove of trees that had been here for hundreds of years, and that had been enjoyed by the earliest settlers, the Erie County Fair in the 1850s. He saved this grove. And people before him had saved it too, but what he did was extraordinary. So he said, I'm going to buy it, give it to the village, but he put a caveat on it and said that the village, it shall always be a village park, both the grove and the baseball diamond, and it will always be open as a public park. Which was one of the concerns with private ownership. So he didn't want to privately own it. He could have easily continued that cycle of privately owning it and keeping it open, but he gave it to the village, and he put that on it, that it shall always be a public park. And so that's very important. That's very important, because we can't build houses here. We can't put up a grocery store or a road through to connect Park Place to make it easier. We can't do that. It shall always be a public park for the enjoyment of the public. And that's actually come up a couple times as to when they were starting to charge admission for things during outdoor events. They were charging admission for baseball games. And that question has come up of whether charging admission actually makes it not a public park anymore. Over the years in the newspaper, you'll see that over and over again. And so it's become an important part going about the current use, the current use of the park, the present day use of the park, what Mr. Hamlin's intentions were. So that was one caveat: always shall be a public park. Second was that the village would invest $100 in improvements each year. $100 is not a big deal today, and whether or not it's $100 with inflation, we spend $100 on the park. And I guess the idea is that we shall not ignore it. If we ever abandon the park and not spend any money on it, putting that $100 in there per year pretty much guarantees that Hamlin Park won't ever be neglected, that the village won't just let it sit. They have to spend some money on it each year. And that was kind of ingenious, that the village has to spend money on it so that it will never get forgotten. If either one of those two caveats don't get met, the park goes back to Mr. Hamlin's heirs, and they are still around. So the Hamlin Park could become private property again if the village doesn't meet its obligation. And we're 126 years later, and we still have to meet that obligation. Always open to the public, and spending at least $100 on the upkeep of the park. I was talking to the young children of the summer camp here at Hamlin Park, and I like to remind them that, never take the park for granted. That we have Mr. Hamlin to thank, and in a lot of places this would have ended up as a housing development here, and there is proof that that was the plan, and that it didn't happen. So the park gets transferred to the village, and the village, they were planning to name it Central Park when it was originally proposed that the village buy it, but because of Hamlin's gift, they renamed the park Hamlin Park. So it was known as Holmes Grove, and it became known as Hamlin Park, and almost immediately they started making improvements. And the pavilion behind me, where is now home to Aurora players, the Roycrofters built that. Improvements to the baseball diamond. They put an iron fence around the entire park because animals were coming in. Remember, this was wide open, and at least until that point when more houses were coming in. But animals, livestock were roaming the park. There was actually a great old story of an old pine tree that was here in the grove that a bear had lived in at one time. The bear had lived up in the tree, and that was documented in the newspapers when the tree was chopped down. So the Grove looks a lot different than it would have before those improvements, when Hamlin Park became a public park and the village started making improvements, putting the paths in, fixing the baseball diamond, putting some of the recreational facilities in. This actually was covered. There are reports of this being covered in violets. The lawn you see, the grass lawns, you would not have seen on people's, even on their front lawns. This is a modern thing, but this would have been a grove of, they said, violets were growing all around here. And the trees over the centuries had, it was an active natural forest, wooded area that the trees would have died off and regrown, and the natural cycle of the grove would have taken place. But with its use in modern days, we have to actually pay attention, and you'll see the news reports today of people the village needing to pay attention to the trees, replacing the trees because we're using it more actively today, and there's lawn instead of a forest bed on the ground of this grove. So it does look different today, but we are using it in a similar way, and we have a lot of people to thank over the years for preserving this wonderful grove. Now, this is like I said, this is a third of the park. The baseball diamond, the Griggs Place Park came along much later. It was the football team had been playing on the outfield of the baseball diamond, and they had so much trouble finding a safe place to play football. So the high school ended up buying the end closest to Griggs Place for the football field when the high school was on Main Street. And after the high school was built in 1970 up on Center Street, they didn't need this field anymore. So the village took over that end of Hamlin Park from the school district. And so that's why present day Hamlin Park goes from Prospect Avenue all the way down to Griggs. But in the early days, it was just this grove, and then the meadow south of it became sort of part of it. With people, there were no trees. There was a meadow, open meadow, and someone started to play a baseball game informally. The men would play a informal baseball game while people were picnicking here in the Grove, and then it developed into a baseball diamond. So that's how Hamlin Park developed in sort of three sections. Present day discussions about the use of Hamlin Park are very important. We see some heated debate about the use of it, but it's a very important discussion to have because Mr. Hamlin had set it out as a public park, and I am asked sometimes for my opinion on it, and I think that I do often go back to what was the original intent of this park. And that I think sometimes you hear the kids behind me right now playing, and I think, not to speak for someone who's not been with us for over 100 years, but I think you'd be thrilled to see what's happening in the park now. But there is that debate, that balance over how the park is used, and to make sure that it's not overused, and that the grove that we have here is not destroyed because of modern use. And so that debate is very important. And that discussion is very important, making sure that trees remain and that trees are replaced so that the grove doesn't disappear. Because ask any tree expert, they'll tell you, I'm not a tree expert, but they'll tell you that it doesn't take long for the domino effect to happen, where one tree goes and they're not replaced, and then all of a sudden you don't have a grove anymore. So it's a very important discussion to preserve this grove. It becomes preserving the grove isn't something that happened just in the past. It's something we really need to be thinking about today. So that's why Hamlin Park is the way it is. That's why our grove is here, and that's why the grove is so important, because it's actually fascinating that it's still here, and that it survived hundreds and hundreds of years, and then at least the last 200 or so years that we as settlers have been here, and that it hasn't gone away, that somehow the woodman's axe, as they said in this little brochure, had not taken it down, even though everything else around it was cleared. So never take this little park, this little grove for granted. Originally known as just the Grove, and then Holmes Grove, and now part of Hamlin Park. So from Hamlin Park, thank you for joining me for our weekly chat about local history. I would love to have your questions about Hamlin Park. Again, I am lot more detail. I lived and breathed Hamlin Park for several months, actually years, in my research, and it'll be coming out in the first of a series of books that I have, because I just think it's so important, and I think the story of this little park is fascinating, East Aurora's little central park. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, put them in the comments, or send me a private message, and I'll try to get back to you. Also, if you have any topic ideas or questions that are on your mind, please send them to me, either via the comments or a private message. And I'm trying to keep up. I have a lot of great ideas, and so I'm only doing this once a week, so I just keep adding to the list. So I'll get to them eventually. And thank you for supporting this project. I enjoy speaking with you each and every week, getting a lot of great feedback. And the viewership numbers seem to be going up, so I enjoy that as well. And I think it's a good way to chat about my upcoming writing projects and my books that are coming up as well. So I get some great feedback and great ideas. Again, I am Robert Lowell Goller. I am the Town and Village Historian, but these videos and most of my research and book projects are not officially affiliated with my duties as Town and Village Historian. And thank you for keeping history alive, and we'll see you next time from Hamlin Park. Take care.